My name is Geno Samuel, and welcome back to Discographies, Yes, where I'm talking about every single Yes studio album in chronological order, and offering a brief overview of the making of it and my opinion as well, and review. So after their humongous tour after Tornado, the band went on a little break and planned to reconvene for rehearsals and songwriting in November 1979 in Paris, hoping to work with producer Thomas Baker, who produced Queen among other big names. John Anderson and Rick Wakeman were having a tremendous time writing songs together, but the other three weren't feeling it, and they were doing their own thing and felt that John and Rick's offerings were too lighthearted and folksy. Steve Howe, Alan White, and Chris Squire and Baker were going in a more heavy, aggressive direction musically, and on some scheduled rehearsal sessions, they refused to show up in the studio, leaving John and Rick alone. There was a huge rift in the band at the time, leaving Anderson and Wakeman incredibly depressed. Then one day they drank their sorrows away at a bar and crying on each other's shoulders, lamenting that this wasn't the band that they wanted to be in anymore. Now, there was a lot of conflict in the studio, and now I'm actually going to quote directly from Wikipedia because I couldn't possibly have phrased it better myself. The sessions were ultimately called off after White cracked a bone in his right ankle while roller skating early in the morning with Richard Branson in a nightclub, rendering him unable to perform for about 6 weeks. So after that fiasco, they tried to carry on with sessions in London, but ultimately the band itself could not resolve their interpersonal drama, and Anderson and Wakeman left the band in March 1980, leaving the band to carry on without Wakeman again, but more significantly, the band quite literally lost its voice, and they marched on somehow as a three-piece rhythm section for a little while. Meanwhile, their manager Brian Lane just became the manager of the two-piece pop act The Buggles, consisting of Trevor Horn on vocals and bass, and Jeff Downs on keyboards, who were still riding high due to their worldwide smash hit Video Killed the Radio Star. Lane assessed the situation and thought, quite rightly, 2 + 3 = 5. The Buggles were big Yes fans anyway, and Horn had seen them play live during their Relayer tour, commenting that their performance of Gates of Delirium brought him to tears. Lane invited the duo to play a song for Squire at his mansion, and Chris remarked that Trevor sounded a bit like John Anderson at times. So he invited them along to a Yes rehearsal, and they were at first confused by the absence of Anderson, but Squire didn't address the matter when asked. The Buggles then presented the band an 8-minute-long track, which was deemed too long to be on a Buggles record, but could be more suitable for a Yes album. It was called We Can Fly From Here, and the band really liked it and were keen on recording it. It didn't make it onto the record back then, but we will be revisiting that song much, much later. After getting confirmation from the president of Atlantic Records, Horn and Downs were pushed into the new lineup of Yes, though Horn was quite uncomfortable at first given the relationship John had developed with the fans. So this became the new Yes, and they were under great time pressure to record a new album because their next tour had already been planned and tickets were already sold even before Anderson and Wakeman departed. So they recorded the album in about 3 months. The sessions were at first produced by Eddie Offord, making a triumphant return perhaps, only to leave very suddenly early on due to some strange circumstances that no one really disclosed. He still retained a credit as a producer of the backing tracks on the album. Yes took on the role of producers once again, but were assisted this time by 3 very competent and successful producers and engineers. Hugh Padgham, Gary Langan, and Julian Mendelsohn. The recording sessions were pretty hectic, with Trevor Horn remarking that he got married during the making of the album, and he was back in the studio 2 hours after his wedding. And instead of his planned 2-week-long honeymoon in Miami Beach, the newlyweds spent 3 days in Bournemouth, and Steve Howe came along too. So the new Yes came out with a new album, Drama, and I can actually show this one. So as you can see, Roger Dean came back to do the sleeve art for the album, considering that John Anderson wasn't there to stop him anymore. It's a really nice piece. It's more realistic, I guess, rather than the floating islands concept. Jesus Christ, what the hell is happening in here? I don't know what the hell this boy band pose is. It kind of reminds me of the Queen Cheer Heart Attack record, you know, when they're all lying on their backs and one of them is shirtless. Why is Alan White shirtless? Why is Why does Steve Howe have a halo around his head? Jeff Downes is having none of it. Anyway, so the artwork is great, but how does the music inside sound, and how does the new guy compare with John Anderson? Well, let's get right into it. The album opens with Maschine Messiah, which is 10 minutes long, so I guess they're done with the whole pop rock thing of Tornado then. It slowly fades in with a running 3-note motif on a very distorted guitar line, with a generous dosing of phaser as well, played on a Gibson Les Paul. It seems like Howe for the past few years has now been holding off on recording material on his ES-175 of the early 70s. You get a faint count-in from White bleeding into the recording, announcing 4! And then the drums and bass enter, playing a slow riff and halftime field beat. And good golly, it sounds so metal. The heaviest Yes sounded since South Side of the Sky. Downes comes in with some synth chords falling down in pitch like Downes has a completely different keyboard setup to Wakeman, and his sounds bring a new fresh quality to their music. This opening is very heavy on bass. It develops a bit further before going nuts and transitions into the song proper. All of a sudden, an acoustic guitar keeps the rhythm going. The keyboards are so playful and bouncy in these verses. As the vocals come in, new guy Trevor Horn's vocals are kind of hidden because the band sing in 3-part harmony at first, though you can make out a new vocal texture in the mix. And while Horn's singing voice does sound kind of similar to John's, his natural range is a bit lower. The lyrics are a bit more direct and linear, but still not as easy to make out a meaning though. The drums and bass are popping like Rice Krispies, and they sound very rich and full in stark contrast to Tornado. The beat remains punchy and steady as they travel in and out of the chorus that wouldn't sound out of place at all in an Anderson-led composition by Yes. The second verse does something interesting. Everyone except Downes drops out. Downes plays a single huge sustained chord on organ, and probably overdubbed with some other instruments too to make it sound even more significant, as the vocals sing the melody in harmony. And this whole thing sounds like a fresh reimagining of the opening verse in Yours Is No Disgrace. The band go through these little instrumental passages that are repeated again once or twice throughout the piece, displaying the kind of compositional competence I haven't seen pulled off so well since Relayer. Downes as a keyboardist presents a more Tony Kaye-like quality rather than Rick Wakeman, with his, you could say, lack of classical training and fancy solos quite evident. But he plays to his strengths, which I think help shape the album and make it become what it is. Moreover, his keyboard sounds and more basic style of playing suit Howe's style, so much more than Wakeman's parts on Tornado. And honestly, the lack of musical showmanship coming from the keyboards is a huge breath of fresh air after Howe and Wakeman's battle of the notes on the previous album. There's a big mood change to a more classical feel from a synth church organ section, with Chris and Trevor spitting phrases at each other, call and response style. Chris sounds pretty strong here, full of energy, and this is actually the first instance of Trevor singing solo in the song, a good bit into the song actually. He has interesting diction. He kind of sounds like what a lot of modern performers try to do, these exaggerated vowels that you'd never utter in conversations and almost robotic-like delivery sometimes. It's still good, mind you, just interesting and distinct. Jeff Downes comes out with a phenomenal synth solo that's more of a composition rather than the spur-of-the-moment improvised solo type, based on the recurring 3-note motif. But just the tone of it gliding above the rest of the band is a stellar part of the song. Apparently he inserted a part of the toccata from Charles-Marie Widor Symphony for Organ No. 5, 5th movement, which I was not aware of before, continuing the Yes tradition of incorporating other snippets of compositions into their music. That keyboard line is answered by Squire on bass. Frigging amazing, because it is a very difficult fast run to play on a bass. Squire actually complained about it and said that it works better on keys, but was encouraged to keep at it and perfect it, and it really paid off. It's kind of a chilling theme that is then repeated by Howe on guitar, seemingly building to some kind of climax. And it does get to a climactic change of arrangement introduced by descending chords played in octaves on piano, like something straight out of a piano concerto. But the transition has a pretty noticeable chop linking both sections. I haven't heard such a tape splice since Relayer, I think. But yeah, just a little detail. So anyway, This new section is a repeat of the intro motif, but slower and more ominous due to the dramatic synth choir awing away and to the tastefully sluggish guitar line bending into the notes of the melody. There's another cool transition into a spacey acoustic guitar and soft choir segment, with Chris and Trevor singing about Maschine Messiah, kind of reminiscent of the intro of And You and I, actually, taking you with it, letting you drift away, perhaps floating on that lake on the front of the cover. A sudden explosive rapid set of runs, performed by all, brings us back to the full band arrangement, and explores a couple of the previous themes before revisiting the verse and chorus segments, now complete with a cough-like chugging Hammond organ accompaniment, bringing back a time and a word-like feel to the rhythm. Some parts of the vocals, though, seriously, it feels like Trevor is barely able to reach those high notes. Chris too, for that matter. It's a great melody, but ironically enough, only John Anderson could pull off those melodic moves. The shorter motifs scattered throughout are readdressed here, as the song is coming close to finishing. This is a really great display of compositional prowess, showing that Yes are making up their own song structure that features more than just the two basic musical ideas, being verse, chorus. This one has about 5 or even more, all arranged in an interesting way and linking into each other naturally. Anyway, the whole piece slows down again for a reprise of the recurring theme now played on Steve's slide guitar. Very chilling in how he plays it. This leads to one more reprise of the acoustic Maschine Messiah prayer-like singing section, closing in earnest with a fade-out looping the intro guitar riff, only this time with multi-tracked instrumental harmony. It's a stellar track, exhibiting a structural complexity and thoroughness similar to Heart of the Sunrise. It's rich in thought-out melodies that leave next to no room for anyone to perform any spur-of-the-moment type solos. It's an amazing return to the Yes of old, musically. This is followed by White Car, sitting pretty at 1 minute 20 seconds. It's solely attributed to Horn and Downs, who recorded all of his parts on a Fairlight CMI digital synthesizer and demonstrates its sampling capabilities, creating a mini orchestra for the track. There's like 5 lines of singing on the song, and the lyrics are actually an exaggerated and cryptic description of Trevor Horn seeing singer Gary Newman driving by in his white Corvette. They recorded an early demo version with more lyrics, but they ended up making this barely a musical idea thing. I think they said that they were in a rush to finish the album and needed some more music for the record, so this was basically just filler, in essence. It's okay, I guess. It's inoffensive, not much of an idea, and likewise doesn't outstay its welcome. Just a curious addition to the album. The third track is Does It Really Happen?, which was being developed during John Anderson's time with the band, but took on a different feel and melody after his departure. It features a prominent bass line, kind of simple melodically, but really fun to play and listen to. In fact, most of this album is really great for a bass player. The bass line in Does It is very active and has plenty of groovy riffs and chunky rhythms. The beat stays pretty basic, which really brings out the more active bass line, which kind of has a counter-rhythm feel to it, playing in 7/4 time with the rest of the band keeping a steady 4/4 beat. Then they launch into a curious little melody that everyone plays in unison, which would eventually become the chorus of the song, but this time without any vocals. Then they introduce another theme with a straight simplified beat from drums and bass to let the organ and guitar do some creative work, and they play this sequence of really dense, I guess, suspended chords. I'm not sure how suspended, but they aren't major nor minor. This really is another great example of how well the musical stylings of Howe and Downs go together. The organ and guitar sound like one body of sound, like their tones and ways of playing are such a perfect marriage all throughout the album. I kinda get the feeling that, probably intentionally, Steve Howe tries to match the level of complexity of whatever keyboardist he has to bounce off of. Like in Relayer, he complemented the freeform jazz stylings of Patrick Moraz with his own wild licks, and likewise throughout much of Tornado. There was this battle of notes going on between Wakeman and Howe, and now since Jeff Downs isn't technically as virtuosic as those guys, Steve likewise largely tones down his insanity level, and either plays together with the keys, or if he plays something a bit more adventurous on his own, you can near guarantee that Downs plays something strongly similar at some other point in the track. Then the mood changes again as we travel into the verse, and a new riff in the backing track. Pleasantly surprised to hear Chris Squire taking the lead, on vocals. He's sung plenty before on his solo record, you know, Fish Out of Water, for example. So by this point, he's well able, I think, at least in the studio, to very competently carry a tune with much gusto. He really belts out this one. And I think he sings in unison with Trevor Horn, actually. You can tell Horn is in this one because Chris kind of has to change the way he sings so he could better match up with Horn's pronunciations, such as singing the phrase to you as to you. Their voices sort of blend into one another in a way Anderson and Squires didn't. And you can hear a similar thing in Cinema Show off the Genesis 1973 album, Selling England by the Pound, with Peter Gabriel and Phil Collins singing in unison, and they sound like one unit, an absolute unit. It's kind of freaky. Anyway, back to this. They return to the chorus before the chorus for the chorus, but this time with added melody from the vocals. That's kind of simple, but forcefully delivered. The next verse and chorus follow much the same way, with Squire getting a little bit more adventurous with his bass parts at some points. Then after the second chorus, they practically return to the intro segment, playing it almost identically with the addition of rich harmonious vocals on top, singing words and phrases 2 syllables at a time, like they've done in a few songs already. The voices sound really big here. Steve really pulls his weight, filling out the low end of the harmonies. There's also a significant echo effect on the vocals, which I don't recall the band using to such an extent before, and this only contributes more to the new sound the band was developing. In a clever way, they then transition into an a cappella take of the chorus, with harmonies building up one by one, all leading up into a reprise of the previous suspended theme, now led by a freaking marimba, played by, assume, Alan White, who was also featured simultaneously playing a simplified rhythm on his kit on just toms and kick drum. On top of this, Chris returns with the vocal melody of the verse, so it's a cool combination of a couple of themes that are distinct on their own, but can also converge as they have here quite harmoniously. Then the band instrumentally take a flying leap, and seemingly don't land on any kind of conclusionary strike. You think it's over, but it's not. Suddenly, synths come in, playing a melody over a synth reinterpretation of the main hook. Then the rest of the band join in again, and Chris graces us with a little casual bass solo that doesn't get too wild, but is tasty all the way through, leading us into the fade out a little while later. It's a pretty solid track, really nothing that I can take issue with. It's not particularly profound or a meaningful song, it's more of a cool groove, hot jam kind of a ditty. And that's perfectly fine too, those need to exist as well. Nice. Great bass work. Now let's flip the record over and let's get into the Lens. I cannot possibly praise the intro any higher. It starts with a determined simple beat on kick drum and bass, in a waltz-like tempo perhaps, in unison. I think I got that wrong, but anyway. After 4 measures of that, the piano, guitar, and snare come in, playing a fast, quick-hitting rhythm that goes in between the bass and kick hits. And it's an amazing way to, in a sense, turn the drum kit into almost a melodic instrument, rather than just percussion. Then this whole section gets invigorated with a fuller arrangement the second time round, filled with dreamy 80s synth chords and a new slidey melody on a pedal steel guitar. It's alright, I suppose, but I think what I don't like about Steve's use of steel guitars, or like, you know, the slidey guitars that he uses, is that he arrives at the destined notes a little too slow, creating this almost unsure quality to his playing. Again, this is a personal opinion, so feel free to disagree. Anyway, this all slows down and takes a chill pill as Trevor and Jeff perform the verse largely unassisted on just vocals and piano, making you think that maybe Yes will bring out a soft rock ballad for you. There's a cool key change into the choruses of the song. The first one is also pretty down low, and there's also quite an empty space in the music that would eventually build up. The vocals are quite dry and up close, almost like Trevor is in your face singing, "I am a camera." This track also welcomes the return of the choral guitar, heard playing a simple repeated motif in the chorus, a kind of ominous sounding musical idea that reminds me a little bit of the theme music for Chris Chan, A Comprehensive History. A soft, dreamy vocoder bit courtesy of Jeff Downes also makes an appearance in the choruses, further contributing to the new sound of Yes, and perhaps some of the earliest signs of things to come in the 80s, in Yes and in music in general. The chorus features the cryptic phrase "I am a camera," which was taken from the book Goodbye to Berlin by Christopher Isherwood. The second verse takes on a more standardized 4/4 rock feel, though Chris, for the most part, lays pretty low and lets the drums do the talking rhythm-wise. The chorus switches things up with a 6/4 beat that is sort of twisted version of the opening waltz rhythm. There's a very quiet, watery section after the second chorus, full of droplet-like keyboard sounds and horn belting out lines about being by the waterside. This little bit is followed by a casual bass solo-like section that sounds like a theme lifted straight out of The Fish, perhaps another Easter egg callback to their earlier works. Maybe this is an attempt to bring the entirety of the band's discography together. They go through lots of the previous sections now with amped up veracity. The vocoder leaves a more prominent mark now. Instead of singing Oz, it takes on lead vocal duties for like 2 lines to repeat the recurring I am a camera motif. Top marks to Alan White for giving his all on this track especially. So energetic, giving every little piece of his kit a workout really. Hal's fuzzy lead guitar noodles a bit too, to fill in the gaps in the vocal line. I'm not too fond of this one, but he doesn't stick around for long. The song reaches a climax with one more revisit to the opening prog rock waltz movement, finishing with a satisfyingly unresolved ending, which leaves you in suspense, which I feel is quite appropriate since a lot of the song is quite suspenseful. It's 8 minutes long, and kind of feels like not much happened, because it goes by pretty quickly. It's pretty complex structurally, but it's so fast-paced and well thought out, you don't realize it. It doesn't have as many self-indulgent guitar and key solos as many tracks did in previous albums, and I'd say again that this is probably because Steve Howe adjusted himself to the strengths and limitations of the new guy, Jeff Downes. This track got reworked and was recorded by the Buggles on their second album, Adventures in Modern Recording, renamed as I Am a Camera, but without all the diddle-daddles, as Steve put it. Into the Lens has a similar energy and tightness to Maschine Messiah, and funnily enough, I feel like both sides of this record follow a similar pattern. As White Car was the second track of side A, the side B sort of equivalent is Run Through the Light, which takes on a different tone to the tracks preceding and following it. It's more heavy on keyboards and takes on an almost new wave feel. They go all Peter Gabriel on it and take away Alan's hi-hat and cymbals, and apart from a few humongous Phil Collins-like tom fills, is just kick and snare throughout the whole song. Chris is vamping away on chords on electric piano, so that means that Trevor takes on the added responsibility of bass player for the track, using a fretless bass. Trevor said that he was quite uncomfortable providing the bass track for this song because he didn't know what to do with it, and it does kind of sound like that throughout the song. The bass line is a bit unsure of itself, though it is interesting in that pretty much as a rule, for the verses, he never plays the root note of the chords, and resorts to playing in first and second inversions only. As a whole, it feels more like a Buggles track than Yes, even though they've been working on this musical idea ever since Anderson and Wakeman were still in the band. It went through a lot of changes and got a lot of input from Horn and Downes, and it became something else. The melody is interesting, and it's something that only Trevor could pull off with his playful shelter bits. Some light harmony movement in the choruses from Horn and Squire as well. The hook of the chorus is kind of catchy, and probably some of the poppiest musical moments Yes has ever had up to this point. Jeff is in the back, playing these syncopated, tinny synth lines that don't do much for the track, I feel. They don't gel well, and I'd imagine that it was an attempt to yesify this very un-yes-sounding song, but just ends up being cluttered, and would have benefited to keep the track more spaced out. Speaking of spaced out, Steve doesn't do all that much on this one, just playing some little fuzzy fills on his Les Paul in the back for the most part. The guitar track overall is lower in this mix in comparison to other tracks. Interesting. He doesn't really come out in front until the new bridge movements that have a fuller arrangement coming from keyboards and are in fact the biggest parts in the song, bigger than the choruses. It's a very quacky keyboard sound, like a clavinet maybe, that dominates these sections. Some bits though feel quite sloppy and musically nonsensical, with both Howe and Horn at a loss at what to do, and feel like if they had more time in the studio, they could have worked out the arrangement a bit better and have come up with more solid compositions and transitions. It's an odd entry on this album. It's okay, but whereas on other tracks my feelings are, this is awesome, I can't wait to see where they take this, here I was thinking, okay, when is this gonna end? Like White Car, this is a little change of pace, and maybe even a dip in consistency, but it's by no means terrible, just fair. Which leads into the final track on the album, Tempus Fugit, a Latin expression meaning time flies, which is a recurring hook in the chorus. The title was apparently a reference to Chris Squire being always late for everything. This is another track that was being developed since 1979, before the lineup change. The opening is another exhibit of how Down's organ and Steve Howe's now Fender Stratocaster sound so alike, a chunky and bright rhythm that repeats throughout the song. Squire delivers the bass line through a pretty heavy effect. I can't decipher if it's a phaser or a flanger, maybe it's a return of the Mutron bass pedal. The whole band go in hard, everyone is pulling their weight. And like so many tracks before, this one features a stellar, very melodic bass line that permeates the mix, and is the main element that consistently keeps going musically, with Steve occasionally whipping out his whammy bar and turning up the reverb for some atmospheric musical warbling, and Jeff playing syncopated chords on organ. The vocoder makes another appearance here, this time quite tongue-in-cheek, delivering the line, "Yes, yes." The lyrics too are a bit of a word salad, but they're kind of fun too. The singing is almost entirely done at least in two-part harmony, assisted by Chris, and they often go back to a feature of just that riff on bass and guitar that's introduced by lyrics leading into a big "yes" each time. There's a return of the previous low-down section featuring a soft "yes, yes" on vocoder that climaxes to the biggest yes ever. So incredibly cool, and the music cuts out right before it, and it sounds so huge and great. Multi-track Trevors, it seems like, delivering a dense chorus of "yes!" And back into the intro we go. Like most of the tracks before it, this one has lots of little melodies, including a really rapid run of arpeggios from guitar and keys. It's also cool. It sounds like you're in a hurry, running out of time. Get it? Everyone lets it rip. Everyone is on fire here, playing fast and precise, tasteful licks and fills, creating this fast-paced world in this little song here, in a similar way to the way Soundchaser came about, I think. Here, nobody is out of place, finishing off the album with a great high-energy, 5-minute-long track that's maybe comparable in energy to the final track off Tornado. Taking the album as a whole, I'd say that it's quite consistent, largely driven by strong guitar and bass riffs. Thankfully, new keyboardist Jeff Downs isn't as good as Rick Wakeman, so this helps keep Steve Howe sedated for the majority of the album. The thoroughness and logic of the compositions is something that has been missing from the band for quite a while now, and I'd imagine that if John and Rick had stayed with the band, their 10th album would have sounded like something between Tornado and John and Vangelis. John spoke of the album later, saying that it wasn't his idea of Yes and it didn't represent what Yes truly was. I'm not sure if that's truly his opinion of the music or if he has a negative association with the production due to the bitter end he had with the band. As well he should, because things got really sour, so I don't blame him for perhaps having a negative perception of the album, no matter what music was on it. Personally, I find lots of thematic similarities between this and early 70s Yes. And apart from the strange White Car and just okay Run Through the Light, this is an excellent album and I'd rank it as one of their best. The effects that are present are not overbearing, and nothing is too low or too high in the mix. The balance is great and remains consistent. The band sound big, and fills in the room inside your head, and so full of life. So, Drama by Yes gets an 8.5 from me, standing head and shoulders above the previous two records, I'd say. So the album was released in August 1980. It wasn't as big as albums before, but still was received pretty well, and reached number 2 in the UK and broke the top 20 in the US. Now, they were taking a really big risk to go ahead with the tour when everyone had bought their tickets, expecting the classic Yes lineup with John Anderson at the helm. The Buggles members have never been on such an extended and intense tour before, and their inexperience, unfortunately, was quite noticeable. The North American leg of the tour was pretty well received, and they played 3 sold-out shows at New York's Madison Square Garden. They also performed some unreleased songs that they had been working on, including We Can Fly From Here. As the tour progressed, Trevor Horn's vocals began to strain really badly, since he had trouble hitting the trademark Anderson high notes, and Chris Squire refused to lower the keys of the songs. I guess he took on the role of the band leader, since at the time he was the only original member of the band. The tour in the UK, though, was pretty bad. and the new members were often booed and shouted at on stage. After the tour ended, the band broke up, unable to continue with the new lineup. Everyone went their separate ways. The Buggles were due to make a new album, but early on in its production, Jeff Downes sort of left the duo and formed a supergroup with Steve Howe, former King Crimson and UK frontman John Wetton, and Carl Palmer, the guy who put the P in ELP. This, of course, became the band Asia, but that's a story for another day. Chris Squire and Alan White teamed up with Led Zeppelin guitarist Jimmy Page and began working as a three-piece band called XYZ, as in X, Yes, Zeppelin. They made some demo songs with Squire providing lead vocals, and were also assisted by Green Slate keyboardist Dave Lawson. The band never produced anything apart from some very rare demo recordings, and broke apart. Squire and White then decided to go ahead and record a Christmas single called Run with the Fox in 1981, and would soon form a group with additional members called Cinema. And I will talk about that one and the next Yes album on Wednesday. Like and subscribe for more original music and music reviews. Special thanks to my patrons, and if you're interested in contributing, there's links to my Patreon and original music in the description below. Thanks again. See you around. Lane then invited the duo to play a song for This is so fucking long.